Chapter 40 ends with Joseph still in an Egyptian prison. There was a glimmer of hope for his release in that he correctly interpreted a royal official's dream. But the account ends by telling us that the official forgot all about Joseph as soon as he was, restored to his post. Something then happened to, jog his memory. We read in verse 1, "And then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river," of course that would be the Nile. "Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. And so Pharaoh awoke." So Pharaoh had a dream that was so vivid he remembered it easily upon waking. Do you ever remember your dreams? Some people do. Most people remember their dreams kind of a hazy, uncertain way. Well, the ancients, and especially the Egyptians, believed that dreams were a way that the spiritual realm communicated with the living. A bit later in Egyptian history, they developed elaborate dream interpretation manuals. Well, Pharaoh knew that this dream had special importance because, it was so vivid and because, he just sensed that it meant something. And the proof of that is in what follows, verse 5. "He slept and dreamt a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up from one stalk, plump and good. And behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream." Now Pharaoh knew these dreams, given to him as the ruler of a, vast civilization, were a message that he ought to heed. And so he called in his dream specialists. Verse 8. "Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh." These counselor wise men, they just didn't have a clue what Pharaoh's dreams meant. Verse 9. "Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day." When Pharaoh, and then we pause right there, the way that this is phrased, he means the previous Pharaoh, we read on, "was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream, and it came to pass just as he interpreted for us. So what happened? He restored me to my office, and he hanged him." So the palace was abuzz with Pharaoh's dream and the inability of the wise men to interpret it. Though it doesn't say, Pharaoh was probably raging. "What do you mean you can't interpret my dreams? What do I pay you guys for? Come on, tell me what this means." Well, that's when the royal cupbearer remembered Joseph, a dream interpreter, a premier dream interpreter. Verse 14. "Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh." One of the notable things about Egyptian art from that period is the neat beards that Egyptian men had. They were carefully cut into precise styles. And the higher the status, the more ornate and styled they were. Well, being in prison for at least several years, Joseph's beard was a scraggly mess. Before he could appear before Pharaoh, he had to be made presentable. And that would mean a bath, a shave, and some fresh clothes. Verse 15. "And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream. There is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard that it is said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." So there's more in Joe's response than we might assume at first reading. To see that, this is one of those scenes that we probably want to enter into with a sanctified imagination. Egypt was the world's premier power. Pharaoh's court was filled with earthly glory, splendor, treasure, emblems of power. All who came before Pharaoh were awestruck. Most used the precious time that they had before him to gain some favor, to elevate themselves somehow, to ask a request of some kind. Well, here's Joseph in his mid to late 20s. He's taken out of prison where he's lived for the last several years. He's ushered into the throne room of the world's premier power. He's standing before the world's most powerful man, and he's the one being asked a favor of. If there was ever a moment to grandstand, this was it. But Joseph points Pharaoh and his court not to himself but to God. And look at the exchange. Verse 15 again. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. And so Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Joseph's humility is one of the most amazing moments in all of the Bible, and I think of history. And what makes it all the more stellar is that it's been preceded by years of slavery, injustice, and incredibly confusing circumstances. Verse 17, Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat. They fed in the meadow, and then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. And so I awoke. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads, withered, thin, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine will deplete the land. And so the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Well, as Pharaoh recounted his dream, God gave Joseph the interpretation, which he faithfully shared with the Egyptian ruler. Egypt would have 7 years of great bounty, followed by 7 years of famine, which would utterly consume the surplus of the years of bounty. Now, Pharaoh said that he saw the cows of the first dream come up out of the Nile. Ancient Egypt was a long, narrow realm lying right along the Nile. Anything beyond a couple miles of the Nile is desert. Ancient Egypt was even called the gift of the Nile. Its waters come from the mountains of Sudan and Uganda. So if there's no snowfall in those mountains due to drought, the Nile drops and Egypt can't irrigate its fields. The Egyptians knew what it meant to have a year of drought or light rains. Just one such year was hard. Joseph foretold 7. That would strike utter terror in the hearts of the Egyptians. And it would paralyze Pharaoh because as a god worshipped by his people, he was responsible for their provision. He was supposed to have power over the Nile. If he could not feed his people, they would rebel and oust him. But Joseph's not finished. He has more to say. And I wonder if he didn't offer it in the midst of the stunned silence that followed verse 32. You see, he's standing there and prays for wisdom on what counsel to give. God has obviously given Pharaoh this dream for a reason. What point in telling him what's coming unless there's something that he can do? And so, verse 33, Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be on the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. Joseph has spent the last several years doing exactly this kind of administration, first in Potiphar's house, then in the prison. He proposes that the federal government of Egypt levy a 20% tax on all of the produce of the next 7 years of bumper crops. Pharaoh's going to have to establish a new governmental structure to collect that tax. It'll need a chief administrator who'll oversee a staff of assistants. What's collected will then be stored and doled out during the 7 years of famine. Verse 37. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Joseph's plan was brilliant, and Pharaoh recognized it as such. It was clear to him that God's hand was on Joseph. Not only that he could interpret the dreams that had stymied the wise men, but that he could come up with such a, simple, practical plan. And so Pharaoh nominated Joseph to be the chief administrator of that new government department. When Pharaoh nominated someone, of course, everyone else thought, wow, that's a brilliant idea, because Pharaoh suggested it. Verse 39. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all of this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Now the text makes it seem that Pharaoh did this at their first meeting. That he was so impressed with Joseph that he made him the prime minister of Egypt right then. But it may be better to understand that what we're reading in these verses happened a little bit later, after Pharaoh had seen how well Joseph executed the new tax and storage plan. He saw how everything Joseph did prospered because of God's favor, and decided that it would be wisest to not just put one department under his oversight, but, the entire system and land. So think of this now. Joseph, the one-time slave and convict, became Egypt's prime minister. Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the world's most powerful kingdom. Verse 42, then Pharaoh took his signet ring off of his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. You see, that ring was the symbol of Pharaoh's power. It's what was used to make legally binding treaties, laws, and documents. We read on, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Joseph not only had power, he was allowed to wear its emblems and symbols. Verse 43, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, "Bow the knee." And so he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphath-Paneah. And he gave him as wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. And so Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Translating Joseph's Egyptian name used to be difficult for many years because it was based on archaic roots that had been obscured by time. But more recent discoveries make it clear that Zaphath-Paneah meant Savior of the world. There's a reason that Pharaoh renamed Joseph and decked him out in all of these trappings of Egyptian royal power. You see, it was embarrassing for the Egyptian court that their prime minister wasn't Egyptian. The Egyptians felt themselves superior to others. They were especially suspicious and skeptical of foreigners. Historians and archaeologists have established that slavery, was a relatively new fixture in Egypt at the time that Joseph first went there. While that used to be the subject of much debate, the best evidence is that Joseph came to Egypt during their middle kingdom and lived during the reigns of Sesostris II and III, right around 1880 BC. The proud Egyptians would not have been happy with a foreigner ruling as a regent for Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh tried to camouflage his foreignness by giving him an Egyptian name and having him affect Egyptian customs. The final step in Egyptifying Joseph was marrying him into the Egyptian social network. Asenath was the daughter of the high priest of the main religion of Egypt, the worship of Ra, the sun god. The city of On, later named Hierapolis by the Greeks, was the central city of Ra worship. The priests of On comprised the most learned men in Egypt and became the real power brokers in later Egyptian history. Well, verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. So 13 years had passed since Joseph's brothers sold him to those Ishmaelite traders. 13 years a slave, then a convict. And throughout all that time, Joseph kept his faith in God. Verse 47, now in the plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. And so he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. At first, they kept meticulous records of the collection plan, but eventually the stockpiles exceeded their numbering system. Verse 50. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, which means forgetfulness, for God has made me forget all my toil in all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, which means faithfulness, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. While Pharaoh tried to Egyptianize Joseph, he maintained his legacy as a Hebrew by giving his sons Hebrew names. Though he'd risen in Egypt, Joseph knew that his real identity lay with his family in Canaan. Verse 53. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So this famine was most likely due to a region-wide drought. The entire Middle East was hammered by it. Now, that sounds a little bit like a case of climate change, and there wasn't much use of fossil fuel. So, that's interesting to think about. Verse 55. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all lands. In chapter 47, we will see that the famine lasted so long and was so severe that Pharaoh ended up owning and controlling virtually all the land of Egypt. The people went to Joseph so often to buy bread, their savings were depleted, and they ended up having to sell their lands, their property, and eventually themselves. It was during this phase of Egyptian history that the power of the pharaohs spread over all Egypt. As we end our study, there's something to take note of. Joseph's story provides a striking parallel to Jesus. Let's consider what we've seen so far that points us to Jesus. Joseph was a shepherd, was loved by his father, was sent to his brethren, but was hated by them. He prophesied his coming glory. He was rejected by his brothers. He endured unjust punishment from them. He was sold for silver. He was handed over to Gentiles, was regarded as dead, but raised out of the pit. Went to Egypt, became a servant, was tempted severely, but did not sin, was falsely accused, made no defense, was cast into prison and numbered with sinners and criminals, endured unjust punishment at the hand of Gentiles. He was associated with 2 criminals. One was pardoned, the other was not. The butler with his wine and the baker with his bread. May he speak of the elements of communion? The 3 days before their case was resolved suggests the 3 days before the resurrection. He showed compassion. He brought a message of deliverance in prison. He wanted to be remembered. He was shown to have divine wisdom. He was recognized as having the Spirit of God. He was glorified after his humility. He was honored among Gentiles while still being despised or forgotten by his brethren. He was given a Gentile bride, and he was 30 when he began his life's main work. He blessed the world with bread and was the only source of it. The world was instructed to go to him and do whatever he said, and he was given the name Savior of the world. Some amazing parallels between Joseph and Jesus, and there's more to come.